Everyone in my family laughed when my father left me a condemned fire lookout, buried deep in the Idaho mountains. After 22 years in the Navy, I thought it was his final way of telling me I had never really come home. But my German Shepherd Ranger knew something I didn't. The moment he found a hidden door beneath that old tower, men arrived willing to burn the entire mountain to keep us from discovering what my father had protected for more than 40 years. And when I finally learned why Ranger had been sent into my life, I realized my father had been trying to speak to me long before he died. Stay with me, because what was hidden beneath that tower was never really about money. And if stories about veterans' loyalty and the dogs who refuse to leave their side mean something to you, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Your support helps us keep bringing stories like this to you. The first time Ranger stopped at the door, I thought he was smelling a dead animal. By the third time, I knew my dog was trying to tell me something. What I did not know was that behind that door was a secret my father had carried for more than 40 years, and before the week was over, 2 men would try to kill me for it. My name is Daniel Mercer. I spent 22 years in the United States Navy, most of them in the SEAL teams, and when I finally came home, I discovered that surviving a war and returning from one were 2 very different things. Ranger understood that better than anyone. He was a 90-pound German Shepherd with a black saddle across his back, an old scar beneath his left ear, and the unsettling habit of watching me as if he could hear thoughts I had never spoken aloud. We had worked together overseas during my final deployment. After I retired, paperwork luck and a few favors from people who still answered my calls brought him home with me. I used to tell people I rescued Ranger. That was a lie. He rescued me every morning I managed to get out of bed. The call about my father came on a Tuesday in late October. I had not spoken to him in 11 years. There had been no dramatic argument, no final slammed door, just 2 stubborn men allowing silence to harden until neither knew how to break it. When the county sheriff told me Walter Mercer had died alone at his property in northern Idaho, I sat at my kitchen table for nearly an hour with the phone still in my hand. Ranger rested his chin on my knee. "I should have called him," I whispered. Ranger looked up at me. That was the trouble with dogs. They never gave you the comforting lie you wanted. 3 days later, I stood beneath a cold Idaho sky while 6 people buried my father. Ranger sat against my right leg as wind moved through the cedar trees surrounding the little cemetery. My older half-brother Curtis stood across the grave in a charcoal coat that probably cost more than my truck. Beside him was his wife Vanessa, wrapped in fur and impatience. Curtis had inherited the successful part of the Mercer family years earlier. The construction company, the lake house, the investments. I had inherited my father's temper and his talent for leaving things unsaid. After the service, Curtis approached me with the smile he used when he wanted witnesses to believe he was being kind. "Long trip for nothing, Danny." Nobody had called me Danny since I enlisted. "What does that mean?" I asked. Vanessa answered before he could. The attorney already told us how Walter divided things. Curtis received several investment accounts and a commercial property outside Spokane. Vanessa's son received my father's restored pickup. I received an abandoned fire lookout and 11 acres of mountain timber, almost 30 miles from the nearest paved highway. Curtis actually laughed when he said it. Dad left the Navy hero a condemned tower. Ranger rose. He did not bark. He simply looked at Curtis. That was worse. Curtis took 1 small step backward. I put my fingers against Ranger's collar. "Leave it." Curtis glanced at the dog and smiled again. "Careful with that animal. Some dogs don't adjust well when their useful years are behind them." I felt Ranger's body become rigid beneath my hand. But the anger rising in me had nothing to do with the insult to Ranger. I was looking at my brother and remembering why 11 years of silence had been easier than coming home. "Neither do some men," I said. His smile disappeared. Before he could answer, a woman's voice called my name. Margaret Hale, my father's attorney, was waiting beside an old blue sedan. She was somewhere in her 70s, small enough that the wind seemed capable of carrying her away, but her eyes were sharp. She waited until Curtis and Vanessa were out of hearing range before handing me a narrow canvas pouch. "Your father made me promise you would receive this privately." Inside was a brass key and a military dog tag blackened with age. I turned the tag over. There was no soldier's name on it. Just one word. Mercer. Beneath it were coordinates. Ranger suddenly pushed his nose against my hand. His breathing changed. He sniffed the tag, backed away, then sniffed it again. "You recognize this?" I asked. Margaret watched him carefully. "Your father hoped he would." I looked at her. "What is that supposed to mean?" She hesitated. "Walter visited that lookout every month for more than 30 years. Even after the county declared the access road unsafe, even after his knees got bad. When I asked why, he told me he was keeping a promise. To who, he never said." She handed me a sealed envelope. My name was written across it in my father's blocky handwriting. I started opening it. Margaret caught my wrist. "Not here." There was something in her expression I recognized immediately. "Fear. Read it at the lookout," she said. "And Daniel, if anyone asks whether your father gave you a key, tell them no." I looked toward Curtis. He was standing beside his vehicle watching us. "Does my brother know something?" Margaret followed my eyes, but did not answer. She did not need to. 2 hours later, Ranger and I were climbing into the mountains in my aging pickup. Rain became sleet as the road narrowed. The forest pressed close on both sides, cedar, fir, and pine, turning the afternoon almost black. Ranger sat beside me, staring through the windshield. Then thunder rolled across the mountains. My hands locked around the steering wheel. For half a second I was not in Idaho anymore. I was inside a damaged building thousands of miles away, hearing a radio scream while somebody beside me called for a medic. Ranger moved before I realized I had stopped breathing. He pressed his shoulder against mine. Hard, familiar. I touched the scar below his ear. "I'm here," I said. Maybe I was talking to him. Maybe I was reminding myself. Near sunset, the trees opened and the lookout appeared above us. It was not a cabin. It was an old wooden fire tower standing on a rocky ridge. Its observation room raised nearly 40 feet above the ground. Half the windows were boarded. The staircase leaned slightly east. Rust covered the support bolts. Curtis had been right about one thing. It looked worthless. Ranger jumped from the truck before I could stop him. He did not run toward the stairs. Instead, he moved beneath the tower and began circling one of the concrete footings. "Ranger." He ignored me. That alone made me nervous. This dog had obeyed commands, while helicopters shook the earth beneath him. Now his nose was pressed against wet leaves beside a pile of stones. I walked over. "What have you got?" Ranger pawed once. Leaves scattered. Beneath them was a small steel plate set into the ground. It carried the same word as the old dog tag. "Mercer." I crouched and wiped away mud. A keyhole appeared. The brass key fit perfectly. I turned it. Somewhere beneath my boots, metal moved. Not a simple latch, something larger. Ranger immediately spun toward the tower stairs and started climbing. "Hey, slow down." By the time I reached the observation room, he was waiting beside a narrow door at the back. I remembered enough from childhood to know that door had always been locked. My father once caught me trying to pry it open when I was 12. He had grabbed my shoulder so hard it bruised and said, "Some doors stay closed because somebody paid a terrible price to close them." Ranger sniffed beneath it. Then he sat and looked at me. I pulled out my father's envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "Daniel, if Ranger brought you to the north door, then I was right about him." I stopped reading. My mouth went dry. Ranger had never met my father. At least not that I knew. I continued, "Do not trust Curtis. Do not sell the ridge. And whatever you find behind that door, remember this before you judge me." I did not hide it because I wanted to keep it. I hid it because men died trying to bring it home. Beneath those words, my father had written one final sentence. "Your dog knows the way because another German shepherd taught him." I stared at Ranger. He stared back. Then, from somewhere below the tower, came the unmistakable sound of a vehicle climbing the mountain road. Ranger's ears snapped forward. The fur along his spine rose. I crossed to the window and looked down through the sleet. Headlights moved between the trees. Not one vehicle. Two. Both traveling without hesitation toward a road almost nobody was supposed to know existed. I folded my father's letter and slipped it into my coat. Ranger moved between me and the stairs. "Looks like we're not the only ones who came for Dad's inheritance," I whispered. The first vehicle entered the clearing. The driver's door opened. Curtis stepped out, but the 3 men who climbed from the second truck were strangers, and one of them was carrying a pair of bolt cutters. Ranger gave a low growl. I reached for the old north door. and for the first time in 11 years I understood something about my father. Whatever had destroyed the silence between us had not begun with me. It had been waiting on this mountain long before I ever went to war. Curtis looked smaller from 40 feet up, but the men beside him did not. One wore a dark rain jacket with the hood pulled low. Another carried the bolt cutters. The third stood near the truck and scanned the tree line with the kind of patience I had seen in men who were paid to notice exits before entrances. Ranger saw him too. His growl changed. Lower, more deliberate. I rested a hand against his shoulder. Easy. Curtis cupped both hands around his mouth. Daniel, come down here. We need to talk. I almost laughed. People who wanted to talk did not bring bolt cutters. I stepped away from the window and looked at the north door again. The brass key in my pocket suddenly felt heavier than it had 5 minutes earlier. Ranger moved toward the door, sniffed the crack beneath it, then looked back at me. I know, I whispered. But first, I want to know why my brother brought company. A boot struck the first stair below us. Curtis was coming up. One of the strangers followed. I slid my father's letter into the inside pocket of my coat and stood where I could see the stairs without being silhouetted by the windows. Old habits came back whether I wanted them or not. Distance, angles, hands. Ranger stayed at my left side. Curtis reached the platform, breathing harder than he wanted me to notice. You really climbed all the way up here? He asked. Apparently, his eyes moved past me toward the locked north door. That one glance told me everything. He knew it mattered. Dad should have torn this place down years ago, he said. Then why are you here? Curtis smiled. Because I don't want you getting hurt. You drove 30 miles into the mountains during sleet with 3 strangers because you're worried about me. The man behind him stepped onto the platform. Late 50s. Gray beard cut close. Expensive boots that had never seen mud until today. Mr. Mercer, he said. My name is Nolan Vance. I represent North Star Land and Water. I did not take the hand he offered. He lowered it slowly. Your father and I had business dealings. My father hated business dealings. He hated me, Vance said, surprisingly calm. But that doesn't mean we didn't have unfinished business. Ranger moved half a step forward. Vance's eyes dropped to him. For the first time, the man's expression changed. Not fear. Recognition. That's the dog, he said. Curtis looked annoyed. Yes, that's Ranger. Vance was still staring at him. No, I mean that's the bloodline. Every muscle in my back tightened. What did you say? Vance looked at Curtis, then back at me. He realized too late that he had spoken more freely than intended. Nothing important. You recognized my dog. German shepherds look alike. Ranger bared his teeth. Vance stopped smiling. I stepped between them. You get one chance. How do you know anything about Ranger? Curtis cut in. Danny, nobody came here for your dog. Then stop answering questions, I asked him. The sleet hit the windows hard enough to sound like handfuls of gravel. Vance took a breath. Your father was involved in a private recovery operation decades ago. There were military dogs involved. That's all I know. It was a bad lie. Not because of the words. Because of the timing. Men tell the truth with the pause before the lie more often than with the lie itself. Recovery of what I asked. Vance glanced toward the north door. There it was again. Something that does not belong to you. Ranger barked once sharp enough that Curtis flinched. I kept my voice low. Everything on this ridge belongs to me now. Curtis's face hardened. That's exactly the problem. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded packet. Sign this and the problem disappears. I took it without looking away from him. The first page was a purchase agreement. North Star Land and Water wanted the ridge, the tower, and all mineral and subsurface rights. The number printed near the bottom was $300,000 for a condemned fire tower and 11 acres. You told me this place was worthless at the funeral. I was trying to save you from becoming obsessed, like Dad. $300,000 is a strange cure for obsession. Vance stepped closer. Ranger growled again. Mr. Mercer, that offer expires tonight. Then it expires. Curtis's jaw tightened. Read the whole thing. I don't need to. You do if you want to understand what Dad did. I looked at him. For 1 second, the arrogance was gone. Something else had replaced it. Fear. What did he do? Curtis whispered. He stole something. The words landed harder than I expected. I remembered my father's hands, cracked knuckles, grease beneath his nails. A man who returned shopping carts in empty parking lots because, as he once told me, character mattered most when nobody was looking. You're lying. I wish I was. Vance moved toward the north door. Walter Mercer took possession of material recovered after an aircraft accident in 1981. Material belonging to men who were supposed to deliver it to the government. What kind of material? I asked. Vance did not answer. Curtis did. Evidence. Vance shot him a look, sharp enough to cut glass. That was when Ranger suddenly turned away from all of us. His nose went to the floor beside the north door. He sniffed once, then pawed at the baseboard. A faint sound answered from inside. Not scratching, not movement. A mechanical ticking. Vance went pale. Get the dog away from there. I looked at him. Why? Because if Walter left that system active, you have no idea what you're doing. Ranger pawed again. A thin wooden strip sprang loose from the wall. Behind it was a recessed metal slot, the same size as the old blackened dog tag Margaret had given me. Curtis stared at it. Vance whispered something under his breath. I pulled the tag from my pocket. Daniel, don't, Curtis said. That's the first honest thing you've said since you got here, I replied. Which is exactly why I'm going to. I slid the tag into the slot. There was a click. Then a deeper sound moved through the wall. Gears. Old steel. The north door unlocked. Ranger pushed it open with his nose. Cold air rolled out. Beyond the doorway was not a storage closet. A narrow staircase descended through the tower's central support column. Curtis swore. Vance stepped forward. I blocked him. You stay here. That compartment contains property belonging to my company. You just told me it belonged to the government. He said nothing. I almost smiled. You should coordinate your lies before driving up a mountain together. Ranger was already halfway down the stairs. I followed. Behind me, Curtis called my name. I ignored him. The passage was barely wide enough for my shoulders. The air smelled of rust, cedar, and old dust. 20 feet down the stairs ended at a steel door embedded inside the tower foundation. Ranger stopped before it. Painted across the metal was a faded silhouette of a German shepherd. Beneath it were two names. The first was Walter Mercer. The second was Thomas Keene. My heart stopped for half a beat. Thomas Keene had been my father's closest friend when I was a child. Uncle Tommy, I had called him. He disappeared when I was 9. My father told me he had died in a hunting accident. Ranger pressed his nose against the second name and whined. I crouched beside him. You know that name too. Then I noticed something hanging from a hook beside the door, a leather military working dog collar, cracked with age. A brass plate was still riveted to it. I wiped away the dust with my thumb and read the name. Odin Ranger's entire body changed. His ears lowered. His tail stopped moving. He sniffed the collar once and made a sound I had never heard from him before, a soft, aching whimper. I stared at the faded number stamped beneath Odin's name. I knew that number, not because I had seen this collar before, but because the first 4 digits matched Ranger's original kennel identification records. Bloodline records. My father had not been guessing. Ranger really did come from this dog. A floorboard creaked above us. Then another. Vance was coming down, despite my warning. Ranger spun toward the staircase and growled. I took the old collar from the hook and tried the handle on the steel door. Locked. On the wall beside it was a small hand-cranked recorder, the kind my father used to keep in the garage when I was a kid. A cassette was already inside. A strip of masking tape carried one sentence in his handwriting. For Daniel, only. I pressed play. Static filled the narrow chamber. Then my father's voice came through, older and rougher than I remembered. Daniel, if you're hearing this, then they found the ridge sooner than I hoped. Listen carefully. Thomas Keene did not die in a hunting accident. I lied to you because the truth would have put you in danger before you were old enough to understand it. Thomas died on this mountain. Odin stayed beside him for almost 2 days. And what Thomas died protecting is still behind this door. Ranger pressed against my leg. My father's voice continued. Do not open it for money. Do not open it because someone threatens you. Open it only if Ranger chooses the door. His bloodline was trained for one purpose: to recognize the scent that tells you the chamber has not been compromised. I looked down. Ranger was sniffing the steel seam. Once, twice. Then he sat, calm, certain. From the staircase behind us came Vance's voice. "Move away from that door." I turned. He was standing 10 feet above me. The polite businessman was gone. In his right hand was a pistol. Curtis stood behind him, staring at the weapon like he had only just realized what kind of men he had invited onto the mountain. Vance pointed the gun at my chest. Walter wasted 45 years protecting something that could have made all of us rich. Ranger stepped between us. "Call off the dog," Vance said. I rested one hand on Ranger's back. "You recognized him before you recognized me." Vance's eyes flicked toward the old collar in my hand. "Of course I did. My father was there the night Thomas Keene died." The recorder was still playing behind me. My father's voice crackled through the static. "And Daniel, if Nolan Vance is standing in front of you when you hear this, then you are looking at the son of the man who killed Thomas." Nobody moved. Not me. Not Curtis. Not even Ranger. For one long second, the only sound inside that mountain was my dead father's voice. Then Vance raised the pistol higher and said, "Open the door." "Open the door." Nolan Vance said it quietly, and somehow that made the pistol in his hand feel more dangerous. Men who shout are usually trying to convince themselves. Vance did not need convincing. Ranger stood between us, shoulders squared, head low, a growl rolling through his chest. Behind Vance, Curtis had gone pale. I could see his eyes moving from the gun to me, then toward the staircase, as though he had finally started calculating how far he would have to run to escape the decision that brought him here. My father's recorded voice hissed through the old speaker behind me, distorted by decades of dust. "Daniel, there is one more thing you need to understand." Vance's eyes snapped toward the recorder. "Turn that off." I did not move. "Walter," my father's voice continued, "if you're hearing this with someone standing behind you, don't let them rush you. The lower chamber has only one safe entrance." Vance stepped down another stair. I said, "Turn it off." Ranger barked. The sound exploded through the narrow shaft. Vance's pistol shifted toward him. Everything inside me went cold. "Point that weapon at my dog again," I said, "and whatever is behind this door dies with me." He studied my face. Then the muzzle moved back toward my chest. "You always were Walter's son. You never knew me. My father did. Your father murdered Thomas Keene." Something flickered behind his eyes. "That's Walter's version. Then give me yours." Vance smiled without warmth. "Open the door and I'll tell you everything." "Wrong order." Curtis finally spoke. "Nolan, maybe we should go." Vance did not even look at him. "Be quiet. You said nobody was getting hurt. And nobody has to." Curtis swallowed. "You brought a gun." Vance turned his head just enough to answer him. "I brought insurance." That was when I understood Curtis had not come up this mountain intending to kill me. He had come because he believed there was money beneath it, and because greed had made him stupid enough to trust a man who knew far more than he did. It did not make me forgive him, but it changed the room. There were no longer two men against me. There was one dangerous man, one frightened fool, one retired SEAL, and a German shepherd who had already decided exactly where he stood. I lowered my hand toward the steel door. "The key," Vance said, slowly. I pulled the brass key from my pocket. It fit into a recessed lock beneath the faded image of the German shepherd. Ranger immediately turned and sniffed along the bottom seam. My father's recording continued behind us. Odin was trained to detect petroleum accelerants, explosives, and certain industrial solvents. Thomas believes someone was using the old recovery site to hide chemical drums after the crash. Odin found them before we did. I froze with my hand on the key. Vance's expression tightened. Suddenly, this was not sounding like buried money. "Keep going," he ordered. I turned the key. Nothing happened. Ranger sniffed again, then moved to the left side of the door and sat. I remembered my father's instructions. Open it only if Ranger chooses the door. I pressed the key inward and turned again. This time, 3 heavy bolts withdrew inside the wall. The steel door opened less than an inch. Cold, dry air touched my face. Ranger remained calm. I pulled it wider. The chamber beyond was larger than I expected, carved directly into the rock beneath the tower. Metal shelves lined both sides. No gold, no cash, no crates of weapons. Rows of sealed document cases filled the shelves. Photographs. film canisters, sample jars, old military storage boxes. Against the far wall sat a battered red emergency case, marked with the faded insignia of a federal agency. Vance stared past me. For the first time since arriving, he looked afraid. "Where is it?" he whispered. "Where's what?" He pushed the pistol toward me. "The manifest." I heard Curtis behind him. "You told me there were bearer bonds." Vance ignored him. Curtis's voice rose. "You said Walter stole bonds from a crashed government plane." "Shut up. There aren't any bonds, are there?" Vance finally turned. "There was never supposed to be a need for you to know." Curtis stared at him, as if the last 11 years of his own life had suddenly rearranged themselves. "You used me. I paid you." Those 3 words destroyed whatever remained of their partnership. Curtis took a step backward. Vance swung the pistol toward him. "Stay where you are." Ranger used the distraction before I could. He lunged up 2 stairs, not for Vance's arm, but into his knees. Vance stumbled. The pistol discharged. Inside that steel chamber, the shot sounded like the mountain had split open. My body moved before my mind caught up. I drove my shoulder into Vance and slammed his gun hand against the stone wall. The weapon dropped between the steps. Curtis kicked it away. Vance struck me across the face. White light burst behind my eyes. He was stronger than he looked. He grabbed my coat and drove me backward into the steel door. Pain shot through my ribs. Ranger came again, teeth catching Vance's sleeve and locking down. "Ranger, hold," I shouted. The dog planted all 4 feet and pulled. Vance screamed and swung at him. I caught his wrist. "Don't touch him." I twisted until his knees hit the steps. Curtis grabbed the pistol from the floor. For one dangerous second, nobody knew where he would point it. Then he aimed it at Vance. His hands were shaking. "Get off my brother." I had not heard Curtis call me his brother with any meaning behind it since we were teenagers. Vance looked up at him. "You don't have the nerve." "Maybe not." Curtis swallowed. "But his dog does." Ranger growled as if agreeing. I pulled Vance away from the staircase and shoved him against the wall. "What manifest?" I demanded. He said nothing. I tightened my grip. "Thomas died for whatever is in here. My father spent 45 years protecting it. You came armed to take it. Start talking." Vance breathed through clenched teeth. "My father owned a logging company. At least that's what the paperwork said. In the late 70s, companies paid him to dispose of things they couldn't legally dump. Solvents, contaminated fuel, industrial waste. The mountain was empty. Nobody cared. Thomas cared." Vance laughed bitterly. "Thomas discovered drums near the watershed. He started documenting everything. Then, a small Federal Survey aircraft went down during a storm. The investigators found evidence connecting my father's company to the dumping. There were photographs, samples, shipping records, names. Your father and Thomas recovered the evidence before my father could reach the wreck. I looked around the chamber. This is the evidence. Most of it. And the manifest." His eyes went toward the old red case. Ranger followed his gaze. So did I. I crossed the room and opened it. Inside was a waterproof ledger wrapped in waxed cloth and a stack of photographs. The first photograph showed 2 young men standing beside this same fire tower. One was my father, maybe 30 years old. The other was Thomas Keene. Between them sat a German shepherd with enormous ears and a dark face. Odin. My throat tightened. My father was smiling. I had almost forgotten he could smile like that. Beneath the photograph was another. Thomas, kneeling beside dozens of rusted drums in a ravine. Another showed dead trout floating in a mountain stream. Another showed trucks carrying the Vance Logging Company emblem. Then I found a photograph that made Curtis lower the pistol. Our father was kneeling beside Thomas, blood covering one sleeve, while Odin stood over a man lying on the ground. On the back, my father had written a date and 5 words. "The night Thomas saved my life." My hands trembled. He told me Thomas died hunting. Vance gave a humorless laugh. "Walter lied because my father threatened both of you. He said if Walter went public, his sons would disappear." The anger I had carried toward my father for 11 years suddenly had nowhere to stand. All those years I thought his silence meant he did not trust me. Maybe silence had been the only shield he knew how to build. The recorder outside the chamber clicked, and my father's voice returned. Daniel Thomas was shot while helping me move the evidence. Odin stayed with him while I went for help. By the time I returned, Thomas was gone. Odin would not leave his body. I promised him that night that no Mercer would ever abandon the truth he died protecting. Ranger walked slowly toward the photograph. He sniffed Odin's image, then looked up at me. I knelt beside him. "Your family kept a promise longer than mine did," I whispered. Ranger pressed his forehead against my chest. Then I noticed another photograph beneath the others. It was much newer. My father, gray-haired and thin, was standing beside a German shepherd I recognized immediately. Ranger. The date on the back was only 6 years old while I was still deployed. I stared at it until the numbers blurred. "That's impossible." Vance looked over my shoulder. "Walter knew your dog?" Curtis asked. I turned the photograph over again. My father's handwriting filled the back. "Daniel thinks Ranger came to him by chance. Let him believe that until he is ready." My heart began pounding. Ranger had been assigned to my unit after another handler was injured. I had always believed it was random. My father had somehow known him before I did. The recorder clicked again. I asked an old friend in the working dog program to watch Odin's bloodline. When Ranger showed the same instincts, I made one phone call. I couldn't bring my son home, but maybe I could send him something that would make sure he wasn't alone when he finally got there. I sat on the cold stone floor. For years I had blamed my father for never reaching out. Yet, halfway across the world on nights when I thought I would not survive until morning, Ranger had slept beside me. My father had reached out. He had simply done it in the only language two stubborn men understood. He had sent me a soldier. Ranger licked my hand. I buried my face against his neck and whispered, "He gave me you." Then Curtis shouted my name. I looked up. Vance had disappeared from the staircase. Curtis was staring toward the open passage. He ran. I stood. "Let him." Curtis shook his head. "Daniel, the other 2 men are still outside." Before I could answer, Ranger's head snapped toward the ceiling. His nose lifted. Once, twice. Then his entire body stiffened. I smelled it a second later. Smoke. Not fireplace smoke. Gasoline. Vance had not run away. He had gone upstairs to finish what his father had started. A dull thump sounded above us. Then another. Orange light appeared at the top of the narrow staircase. Curtis whispered, "Oh God." Ranger barked and raced toward the steps. I grabbed the evidence case and followed him. By the time we reached the observation room, flames were already crawling across the old wooden wall. One of the strangers stood outside on the platform, pouring fuel from a red can, while Vance descended the stairs toward the ground. The entire tower was becoming a chimney. Curtis stared at me through the smoke. "How do we get out?" Ranger did not look toward the stairs. He ran back to the north door, descended 3 steps, then stopped and pawed violently at the wall. Once, twice, 3 times. I remembered my father's warning. The lower chamber has only one safe entrance. He had never said it had only one exit. I looked at Ranger through the thickening smoke. "Show me, boy." Ranger barked and disappeared into the darkness below. I grabbed Curtis by the coat and pulled him after me as fire rolled across the ceiling behind us, because 45 years earlier, another German shepherd had refused to leave a dying man on this mountain, and now Odin's blood was leading 2 Mercer brothers through the same darkness while, above us, the only inheritance our father had ever truly cared about began to burn. The smoke followed us down the narrow stairwell like something alive. Ranger disappeared below, his claws striking steel, then stone, then something that sounded hollow. I kept one hand on the evidence case and the other against Curtis's back as we descended. Behind us, fire roared through the observation room. 40 years of dry timber had become fuel. The heat pushed down the shaft hard enough to make my eyes water. "Daniel," Curtis coughed. "There's no exit down here. Ranger thinks there is. He's a dog." I turned on him. "That dog is the reason I'm still alive." Curtis said nothing after that. We reached the chamber, and Ranger ran past the shelves toward the rear wall. He pawed at a steel cabinet bolted into the rock. I grabbed its handle and pulled. Nothing. Ranger barked and struck the bottom corner again. I crouched. Behind one leg was a recessed lever. I pulled it. The entire cabinet released from the wall and rolled forward on hidden tracks. Cold air touched my face. Behind it was a passage barely 3 feet wide. "Dad," Curtis whispered. He built an escape tunnel. No, he maintained one. The rock around the opening was older than anything Walter could have constructed. My father had simply made sure the mountain kept its second door. Ranger entered without hesitation. I shoved the evidence case ahead of me and crawled after him. Curtis followed. The passage sloped downward through black rock. Smoke thinned behind us, replaced by the smell of wet earth and cedar roots. Every few yards, Ranger stopped and looked back, waiting until he saw my face before continuing. "I'm here, boy." I had said those words to him in places whose names I still avoided speaking. Now he was saying them back without a voice. We crawled for what felt like a quarter mile before the tunnel widened enough to stand. Water ran beneath our boots. Curtis leaned against the wall, coughing. "I didn't know," he said. "About Vance. About Thomas. Any of it." I kept moving. "You knew enough to lie to me." "I knew North Star wanted the ridge. And you were being paid." Silence answered. I turned. How much his face told me before his mouth did. 50,000 if you signed. Another 100 when the transfer cleared. I laughed once, but there was nothing funny in it. "You sold Dad's grave for $150,000. I didn't know anyone would get hurt. Men like Vance survive because people keep saying that." Curtis looked down. For once, he had no answer. Ranger suddenly stopped. His ears rose. Somewhere ahead, an engine started. We had reached the far end. Ranger approached a rusted grate covered in roots. Through the gaps, I saw the lower side of the ridge, and Vance's second truck parked on an old logging trail. One of his men was beside it. Vance himself stood 20 yards away, with a phone pressed to his ear. "The tower's burning," Curtis whispered. "He thinks the evidence is burning with it." I looked at the case in my hand. Let's keep him believing that. We waited until the man beside the truck moved toward the ridge. Ranger watched him go, then looked at me. I pointed toward the trees. "Quiet." He slipped through the opening like smoke. Even with age in his joints, Ranger knew how to disappear when he needed to. Curtis and I followed. Cold rain had replaced the sleet. Above us, the fire tower glowed orange through the trees. Flames climbed into the night sky, carrying pieces of my childhood away as sparks. I should have felt grief. Instead, I felt something strangely clean. My father had not left me that tower so I could preserve old wood. He had left me the truth beneath it. Vance turned. He saw us. His face changed when he noticed the case. "No, I set it behind a fallen cedar. You should have checked for another exit." He reached beneath his jacket. Ranger exploded from the darkness before the pistol cleared the fabric. Vance spun and fired. The shot tore through the trees. Ranger changed direction instantly. He had not been charging to bite. He had been forcing Vance to react. I covered the distance between us and drove both hands into his chest. We hit the mud together. His pistol disappeared beneath wet leaves. Vance caught me across the jaw with his elbow. I rolled, tasted blood, and saw Curtis racing toward us. One of Vance's men came from the trail and slammed Curtis into a tree. Ranger turned toward him. "Ranger guard." The German shepherd planted himself between Curtis and the attacker, teeth exposed. The man froze. Smartest decision anyone had made all night. Vance lunged for his pistol. I caught his ankle and dragged him backward. He kicked me in the shoulder. Pain flashed down my arm. For a moment the forest vanished, and another night replaced it. A doorway overseas. Dust in my mouth. Ranger, younger and faster. A teammate screaming my name. My lungs locked. Not now. Vance crawled toward the weapon. My body would not move. Then Ranger barked. One sharp command. My command. The sound broke through the memory. Idaho returned. Rain mud. Cheddar. My dog. I breathed. "I'm here." Vance's fingers were inches from the pistol when I stepped on his wrist. He screamed. I kicked the weapon away. "You don't get to use my ghosts against me," I said. Vance rolled onto his back, breathing hard. "You think this changes anything? Those records are 40 years old. You burned a tower tonight trying to destroy them. Nobody can prove that." Curtis staggered forward, one hand against his bleeding lip. "I can." Vance stared at him. Curtis pulled his phone from his coat. The screen was cracked, but a red recording symbol glowed. "I've been recording since you pulled the gun downstairs." Vance's face emptied. Curtis gave a tired laugh. "You always said I wasn't smart enough to understand the business. Turns out I was smart enough to press one button. For the first time that night, I almost liked my brother. Almost. Then Vance smiled. It was a terrible smile, because it meant he still believed he had something we did not. "You think my father was the only man in those records?" he asked. "Open the manifest." I looked toward the case. "Why?" "Because Walter never told either of you the whole story." Ranger growled. Vance continued. "Thomas wasn't killed because he found illegal dumping. He was killed because he found out who authorized it." Curtis looked at me. I retrieved the ledger but kept my distance from Vance. The waxed cloth peeled away from a black notebook swollen with age. Pages listed dates, truck, numbers, chemical codes, payment amounts, and names. Most meant nothing to me. Then one did. Mercer. Walter Mercer. I stopped breathing. Curtis leaned closer. Dad Vance laughed softly from the mud. "There he is." Beside my father's name was a payment. $5,000. In 1981, that was not pocket change. "He was part of it," Curtis whispered. "No, but the word came too quickly." I turned pages. Walter's name appeared again and again. Fuel delivery. Night access. Ridge security. Vance watched my face with satisfaction. "Your father wasn't protecting evidence against my family. He was protecting evidence against himself." I wanted to hit him. Instead, I forced myself to keep reading. That was something 22 years of service had taught me. When information hurts, read it twice. The final Walter Mercer entry carried no payment. It contained a handwritten notation from Thomas Keene. "Walter came to me tonight. He confessed everything. He has agreed to help document the site. If anything happens to me, trust him." I read it again. Curtis whispered. He was involved. At first, the truth was uglier than the story I wanted, but cleaner than Vance's lie. My father had done something wrong. Then he had tried to stop it. Suddenly, the silence of his entire life made sense in a different way. Walter Mercer had not spent 45 years guarding the mountain because he was innocent. He had guarded it because he was guilty. Ranger nudged my hand. I looked at him and understood something I had learned too late about men, but dogs seemed to know from birth. Loyalty was not pretending someone had never failed. Loyalty was deciding what you did after you discovered they had. Vance saw the understanding on my face. "He was a criminal, maybe," I said, "but he spent the rest of his life trying to repair what he helped break. That doesn't erase Thomas." "No, it doesn't." I closed the ledger. "That's why he preserved Thomas's evidence instead of destroying it." Vance's expression hardened. Somewhere in the distance came a faint siren, then another. Curtis looked toward the road. Fire crews. Vance heard them too. Panic entered his eyes. He lunged without warning, not at me, but toward the fallen cedar where I had placed the evidence case. Ranger intercepted him. Vance swung his arm. Ranger caught the sleeve and dragged him sideways. "Ranger, release." He released instantly. Vance fell hard. Then a second gunshot cracked from the trees. Ranger yerked. My world stopped. He stumbled 2 steps and collapsed. "Ranger." I hit the ground beside him. Blood appeared along his right side. Not much at first, then more. He tried to stand. No stay. My hands searched through his fur. The bullet had entered near his ribs. I could not find an exit wound. His breathing became shallow. Every other sound disappeared. The fire, the sirens, Curtis shouting, none of it mattered. Ranger looked at me with those same brown eyes that had found me in deserts, hospitals, empty kitchens, and nights when I had sat awake until sunrise, because sleep felt more dangerous than exhaustion. "Stay with me, partner." He licked my wrist. Once weakly, from the trees, Vance's remaining man ran. Curtis started after him. "Let him go," I shouted. "Call emergency services. Tell them we have a gunshot wound and I need a veterinary surgeon. Daniel, we're on a mountain. Then find me somebody who knows how to keep him alive." Curtis grabbed his phone. I pressed both hands against Ranger's side. The old fire tower burned above us, collapsing inward with a roar that sent sparks across the ridge. Ranger flinched at the sound. "Look at me." His eyes found mine, not the fire. Me, his breathing steadied for half a second. "That's it. Good boy." Vance was still lying in the mud a few feet away. He looked at Ranger and then at me. "It's just a dog." I do not remember standing. I remember Curtis stepping between us. Daniel. I stared at Vance over my brother's shoulder. 22 years earlier, a younger version of me might have crossed that distance. But Ranger had spent his whole life trusting my commands. I was not going to betray everything he had taught me, because one coward deserved my anger. I knelt beside my dog again. "You're wrong," I told Vance without looking at him. "The land was never the inheritance." I pressed my forehead against Ranger's. He was. Red and blue lights finally appeared between the trees. Ranger's eyes were beginning to close. No. Stay with me." His tail moved once against the wet ground. One weak tap. The same answer he had given me 1,000 times. "I'm here." Men came running through the forest. Firefighters, sheriff's deputies, a county paramedic. Voices surrounded us. Hands reached toward Ranger. I refused to release him until the paramedic looked directly into my eyes and said, "There's an emergency animal clinic in the valley. We can get him there." They lifted Ranger onto a rescue litter. I walked beside him. Behind us, deputies forced Nolan Vance onto his knees and handcuffed him. Curtis followed silently, carrying the black ledger against his chest. At the edge of the logging road, I looked back once. The tower was gone. Only the 4 burning supports remained against the night. For 11 years, I had believed my father left me nothing but silence. Now I understood what he had really left me. A confession, a responsibility, a chance to finish the promise he had failed to keep when he was young. But as they loaded Ranger into the rescue truck, none of that mattered. Not the evidence. Not Vance. Not the mountain. I climbed in beside my dog and took his head into my hands. "You got me home," I whispered. "Now it's my turn." The doors closed. As the truck began its descent through the rain, Ranger's breathing suddenly changed and the paramedic beside me reached for his equipment. "Daniel," he said, "I need you to move back." Ranger's eyes closed. The monitor clipped near his chest began to slow. I grabbed his paw. "Ranger, you listen to me. We are not done." The truck accelerated down the mountain siren, screaming into the darkness, while I held the partner my father had secretly sent into my life and begged him to survive long enough for me to finally understand why. The monitor slowed again. One tone, then another. Too much space between them. I had heard machines make sounds like that before, beside hospital beds and inside evacuation aircraft, and I knew enough to recognize the moment when everyone in the room stopped pretending there was plenty of time. "Ranger." I squeezed his paw. "Stay with me." The paramedic pushed my hand aside gently and worked near the wound while another man radioed ahead. Rain hammered the roof of the rescue truck. Every turn threw us against the walls. Ranger did not move. I stared at the scar beneath his left ear and remembered the first time I saw him overseas. He had been younger then, all muscle and impatient energy, standing beside a kennel while somebody explained his certifications. I remembered not liking him. That part always made me smile. Ranger had looked at me once, sneezed and turned away, as though he had already decided I was the difficult one. 3 weeks later, he slept outside my door after a mission went bad. Years later, I finally understood that my father had somehow put him on the road that led to me. "Come on, old man," I whispered. "You didn't carry me this far just to quit in Idaho." The paramedic looked at me. "Keep talking to him." So I did. I told Ranger about the first steak I would buy him when we got home. I told him he still owed me a new passenger seat after chewing through the old one. I told him we were going back to that mountain someday, but only after I built a road that did not try to shake my teeth loose. Mostly I kept repeating the same 3 words. "I'm right here." The emergency clinic appeared out of the darkness 40 minutes later. They were waiting at the entrance. The doors opened and Ranger disappeared beneath bright lights surrounded by people in blue scrubs. I followed until a veterinarian put both hands against my chest. "We have him. Let us work. His name is Ranger." "I know. He doesn't like people approaching his right side too quickly." She nodded. "We'll remember." And if he wakes up alone, my voice failed. She looked directly at me. "We'll make sure he isn't alone." The doors closed. I stood in that hallway covered in mud, smoke, and Ranger's blood, and for the first time that night there was nothing left for me to fight. That was harder than the mountain. Curtis arrived nearly an hour later with Margaret Hale. I had forgotten my father's attorney even knew where I was, until she came through the clinic doors wearing a raincoat over her nightclothes. Curtis carried the evidence case. His face was bruised. He sat 3 chairs away from me. Neither of us spoke. Margaret sat between us. "Nolan Vance is in custody," she said. The sheriff recovered his weapon. The fire investigators also found fuel containers, and one of his men has already started talking. I stared at the surgery doors. "Good, Daniel, the ledger matters." "Not tonight." She understood. 2 hours passed. Then 3. Near dawn, the veterinarian came out. I stood so fast the room tilted. Her surgical cap was in her hand. The bullet missed his heart. I could breathe again, but it damaged his lung and fractured a rib. He lost a significant amount of blood. "Is he alive?" She paused. "Yes," my knees almost gave out. Curtis caught my arm. I did not pull away. The veterinarian continued. "The next 24 hours are important, but he's stable enough for you to see him." Ranger looked impossibly small beneath the blankets. Tubes ran beside him. A bandage wrapped his chest. His eyes were closed. I sat on the floor because the chair felt too far away. I slipped 2 fingers beneath his paw. "You stubborn son of a gun." One ear moved. Barely. Then his eyes opened. Cloudy, tired. But they found me. His tail tapped the blanket once. I laughed and cried at the same time. "Yeah, I'm here too." I stayed beside him until morning filled the window. At some point, Curtis entered. He stood near the door as if he needed permission. "Can I come in?" I looked at Ranger. "Ask him." Curtis almost smiled. He approached slowly. Ranger watched him, but did not growl. Curtis sat across from me. For a long time, neither of us knew how to begin. Finally, he said, "I hated you." I looked up. "That's a strong opening. I hated how Dad talked about you after you enlisted. Even when you two stopped speaking, he kept newspaper clippings. Every time your unit was mentioned anywhere, he saved it. I thought he was proud of you and ashamed of me. Curtis' dad barely spoke to me. That's what made it worse. You didn't even have to be there." He rubbed his bruised face. "When North Star approached me, I told myself selling the ridge would prove Dad had wasted his life protecting junk. Then they offered money and I stopped asking questions." Ranger shifted. I rested my hand against him. "You almost got us killed." Curtis nodded. "I know. Saying you didn't understand doesn't erase that. I know that too." I looked at him for several seconds. Then, "What do you want from me?" "Nothing." He placed the black ledger on the table. For once, nothing. That was the first useful apology my brother had ever given me. Not because it fixed anything, because it did not ask me to make him feel better. Margaret returned later that morning, carrying another envelope. "Walter instructed me to give you this only if the chamber was opened and the evidence recovered." I stared at my father's handwriting. How many letters did that man leave? Enough to say what he should have said while he was alive. That hurt because it was true. I opened it beside Ranger. "Son, if you've reached this point, then you know I was not the man you thought I was. But I wasn't the man Curtis thought I was either. I took money from people I knew were doing wrong. I told myself I was feeding my family. Thomas told me a man can use necessity to excuse almost anything if he repeats it long enough. He was right. When I finally agreed to help him expose the dumping, I thought one good act might erase the bad ones. Then Thomas died, and I learned that life does not work that way. You don't erase what you did. You carry it differently." I stopped reading. Ranger's breathing was soft beside me. I continued, "I watched you leave for the Navy and became terrified you would learn what I had done. Then you came home carrying things in your eyes I recognized. Shame, anger, names you couldn't say. I should have told you that a man does not have to be innocent to become worthy of another day. Instead, I stayed silent. That was my greatest failure with you." My vision blurred. I wiped my eyes and kept going. Ranger was my apology before I had the courage to make one myself. Odin's line gave Thomas companionship until his final breath. I hoped one of his descendants might give my son the companionship I was too proud to offer. "If Ranger is beside you, now tell him an old fool says thank you." I placed the letter down. Ranger opened his eyes when I said his name. I leaned close. "You hear that Dad says thank you." His tail moved once. 6 months later, Nolan Vance and 2 associates were awaiting trial on charges connected to the attack, arson evidence tampering, and the shooting on the ridge. The old records triggered a much larger investigation. Some people named in them were dead. Some companies no longer existed. The truth did not arrive as neatly as it does in stories. There was no single morning when every wrong was corrected. Cleanup crews found contaminated soil in 2 ravines and traces of industrial chemicals farther down the old watershed. State and federal investigators spent months sorting through the records Thomas and my father had preserved. Curtis cooperated with them. He also returned every dollar North Star had paid him. I did not forgive him because a calendar told me enough time had passed. But occasionally he called and occasionally I answered. That was more than either of us had managed before. As for the ridge, I refused every purchase offer. Insurance money and a portion of what my father had left elsewhere paid for a small single-story lodge near the site of the old tower. Nothing grand. Wide porch, stone fireplace, 4 guest rooms, a fenced training field behind it. Above the entrance I hung a simple wooden sign, Keene and Mercer Retreat. Underneath in smaller letters, for veterans and the dogs who brought them home. The first guest arrived the following spring. His name was Frank, Vietnam, veteran, 78 years old. He came with an aging Labrador named Molly and told me during his first night that he had not slept more than 4 hours at a time in 50 years. On the 3rd morning, I found him asleep in a porch chair with Molly's head across his boots. I stood inside the doorway and watched them for a while. That was when I finally understood what my father had been trying to protect. It was never 11 acres. It was never a tower. It was never even the evidence. He had been protecting the possibility that something damaged could still become useful. Ranger recovered more slowly than I wanted and faster than the veterinarian expected. He never regained all the strength in his right side. Cold mornings made him stiff. Stairs became something we avoided. But he adapted the way old working dogs do. Without complaint and without asking anyone to feel sorry for him, most evenings we walked to the stone marker I placed where the tower once stood. Thomas Keene's name was carved on one side, Walter Mercer's on the other. At the base was a smaller bronze plate for Odin. One evening in early October, Ranger and I sat there while the sunset turned the mountains copper. He leaned against my leg. I rubbed the scar beneath his ear. You knew before I did, didn't you? His ears moved. Dad, the door. All of it. Ranger looked toward the valley. Yeah, that's what I thought. Wind moved through the cedars. Somewhere below us, men were laughing around the lodge fireplace. One of the veterans had brought a guitar. Someone's dog barked. Another answered. Ordinary sounds. Good sounds. For most of my life, I thought peace would feel like forgetting. Forgetting the missions. Forgetting the people I lost. Forgetting my father before I could forgive him. I had been wrong. Peace was remembering without letting the memory own the rest of your life. I looked at Ranger. His muzzle had gone almost completely gray. I knew our time was no longer measured in decades. Maybe not even years. That knowledge used to terrify me. Now it made every quiet evening beside him feel expensive in the best possible way. I put my hand against his chest and felt the old soldier's heart beating beneath my palm. You know something, partner? Everybody thought Dad left me the worst thing he owned. Ranger looked up. They were right. I smiled. He left me his worst mistake. I looked down toward the lodge, toward the veterans and dogs, finding a little peace beneath its roof. He also left me the chance to turn it into something better. Ranger stood slowly and nudged my hand. Time to go home. We started down the trail together. Halfway there, he stopped. For one terrible second, my heart jumped. Then Ranger turned toward the trees. An elderly man stood at the edge of the lodge parking area beside a German shepherd. The man looked uncertain, almost embarrassed to be there. His dog looked just as tired. I recognized that expression because I had worn it myself. The expression of a man who had survived everything, except coming home. Ranger walked toward him, slowly, limping slightly. The stranger's German shepherd stepped forward. The 2 dogs touched noses. The old man looked at me. Is this the place for veterans? He asked. I looked at Ranger. Then, at the lodge, my father's shame had helped build, and Thomas Keene's courage had made possible. Yes, sir, I said. You found it. The man looked toward the porch. I don't have much money. You don't need any. His eyes filled, and he quickly looked away. Ranger went to his side and leaned gently against his leg. The old man lowered a trembling hand onto Ranger's head. Something in his face softened. I had seen that happen before. It had happened to me. So I picked up the man's bag and led him toward the light. Behind us, evening settled across the mountain where a fire tower once stood. And for the first time in my life, I did not feel like I was walking away from my father. I felt like we had finally finished the same mission. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money, land, or something we can hold in our hands. Sometimes it is a truth we were finally ready to hear, a second chance we never expected, or a loyal friend who stays beside us until we find our way home. Daniel could not change Walter's mistakes, and he could not recover the years they lost to silence. But he could decide what those mistakes became. With Ranger beside him, he turned an old burden into a refuge for veterans and the dogs who had carried them through their darkest days. Maybe that is the lesson worth remembering. We cannot rewrite yesterday, but as long as we are still here, we can choose what we build from it tomorrow. If this story stayed with you, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story from our channel. And wherever you are listening from tonight, take good care of the people and the faithful animals who have never stopped walking beside you.